I'm Reeve. This is Derek Black and Khalil Mohammed. We're here to talk about the white nationalist efforts to normalize hate. It's something that's on a lot of people's minds after Charlottesville, where a white nationalist rally ended in the death of a woman, Heather Heyer. I was a reporter at that rally for Vice News Tonight, so we wanted to start off with a clip that shows what that scene was like.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Blood and soil! 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 Whose streets? Our streets! 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 Whose streets? Our streets!
You got mace?
Yeah.
By who?
By commies.
Trying to figure out what's going on now. It's too late, bro. Y'all just be ready for tomorrow. Y'all couldn't help a couple people that was out here tonight. Just be ready tomorrow at least.
So, I wanted to get you guys' reaction to those events, like when it happened. Derek, you were in a very unique position in that you were horrified by these events, but also worried about your family.
Yeah. So when I first saw the news about it, I had heard a little bit that it was going to be organized like a week before or something, not because of any particular connection, just the news. Yeah. And so my first reaction was wondering how many people I knew were going to be there, and then as it got more and more chaotic, if they were being hurt. So I had this concern, and then I also had the concern that I have quite a few friends who are anti-racist activists at UVA. So as the thing played out, I was sitting there watching the news, thinking first, like, this is just another WN rally. They have rallies, saying the same things they always say, and it got bigger. I don't know, it got more chaotic, it got a little bit crazier than I thought it would, and then there was the national view of it, and then there was the president's response to it, and it spiraled much more than I had expected it.
What about you, Khalil?
Well, I saw shorts and t-shirts and polo shirts, and I thought these are everyday people who are animated by a kind of racism that is very much subterranean in the country. And for them, this is a moment to stand up in a visible way in light of the president's permission to express these views in this moment. And so on some level, I was viscerally horrified by it. At another level, I was strangely appreciative of being able to see the collapsing of the stereotypical image of a white supremacist in the way that we saw the next day versus these people who were clearly at line shopping at Target or Home Depot with all sorts of regular people. So
Derek, you spent the first 2 decades of your life working in the white nationalist movement. And what are those people like? Are they all poor? Are they all living in Alabama? What kind of people are they?
So some of them live in Alabama, though. I think it's this strange misconception that the white nationalist movement is like a movement of impoverished people, or a trailer park movement, or people who haven't thought through their beliefs. It doesn't make sense if you think about it, because who has the resources to travel across the country to go to do things, not just Charlottesville, but more normal conferences that they'll have at hotels where people speak and they talk about tactics and how we're going to play the media, how we're going to get attention. It's people who have more money. It's not a wealthy movement, but it's generally upper middle class people, lawyers, bankers, people who have good jobs, and the ability to participate in something like this and be independent. It's sort of an odd idea, actually, that people without education, without money, would be running something like this.
This is actually, I mean, to Derek's point, this is precisely what was so apparent in the cast that we saw play out in the report. Not only does your point about these being at least economically mobile people, in the way that we know that the salary range for the greatest white percentage gap for Trump versus Hillary was people making $50,000 to $99,000, precisely people whose incomes are well above the median income. It's also true that since the 1920s, with the wide support, historian Linda Gordon estimates that something like 4 million people supported the rebirth of the Klan in the 1920s. These folks were very much professionals in their community, very much upwardly mobile, very much influential, and saw their effort as a patriotic duty, which elicited tremendous sympathy even from the White House at that time under President Woodrow Wilson.
So let's take a look at an interview I did with a white nationalist named Christopher Cantwell. He had a podcast, very extreme, very full of racial slurs. He's currently in jail on charges relating to that torch march. So let's see what they actually believe.
Who drove how long to get here?
12 hours from our car. We've been driving from north of the border, so.
Oh, you came down from Canadistan. If I was doing the radical agenda in Canada, I'd probably be arrested for it, right?
Yeah, well, in Canada, hurting people's feelings is basically illegal. I mean, it's not really criminal, but
unless they're white males.
So when did you get into, as you said, the racial stuff?
When the Trayvon Martin case happened, you know, Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and all these different things happen, every single case, it's some little black asshole behaving like a savage, and he gets himself in trouble, shockingly enough. Whatever problems I might have with my fellow white people, they generally are not inclined to such behavior, and you know, you got to kind of take that into consideration when you're thinking about how to organize your society.
In Oklahoma City.
Okay, so exactly. You have to go back to Oklahoma City to talk about a white act of terrorism,
Elliot Rodger,
right?
Dylan Roof.
Okay, so now you've managed to name 3 people, and I'm pretty sure Elliot Rodger wasn't explicitly white, by the way. But the thing is, you remember the names of white bombers and mass shooters, okay? Can you tell me the name of all 19 hijackers on 9/11 off the top of your head? You can remember Dylan Roof's name. You can remember Tim McVeigh's
white
name.
people were capable of violence.
I didn't say capable. Of course we're capable. I'm carrying a pistol. I go to the gym all the time. I'm trying to make myself more capable of violence. I'm here to spread ideas, talk, in the hopes that somebody more capable will come along and do that. Somebody like Donald Trump, who does not give his daughter to a Jew.
So Donald Trump, but like more racist.
A lot more racist than Donald Trump. I don't think that you could feel about race the way I do and watch that Kushner bastard walk around with that beautiful girl, okay?
Can you talk a little bit about the right adopting the politics or the political style of the left?
We don't have the camaraderie, we don't have the trust level that our rivals do. And that camaraderie and trust is built up through activism, and that is one of the tactics that we're adopting.
A lot of the white nationalists that I talked to claim that they were radicalized by Black Lives Matter in particular, that Chris Cantwell said that he was looking into this whole police shooting thing, and he couldn't escape this data about Black people and crime rates and IQ. Is that a familiar argument to you?
Yeah. I don't know Christopher Cantwell, so I can't talk about him. It's pretty important, though, to understand that white nationalists recruiting and activism is rooted in that stuff. There are organizations that specialize in it and trying to go through the most recent FBI crime statistics and say, look at how much more violent people of color are. That the real threat here is to white people for rapes and murders and robberies, and this is a pretty familiar thing for 20th century in America, and it looks pretty sophisticated. This idea that white nationalists come to a conclusion based on these unavoidable facts, I think is also a pretty common trope, which I feel a little bit like a jerk trying to deflate their bubble, but this is something that you hear all the time. I started out as a liberal, and I loved everybody, and I wanted everybody to be happy in a multicultural society, but crime and IQ and racial differences were just so unavoidable and so obvious that I had no choice but to be a white nationalist. And that is just, the idea that you didn't start out thinking that race was a big deal and you came to that conclusion. I have never met anyone who that was true of.
Khalil, you spent a lot of time doing academic research on these statistics. Can you tell us about the history of that?
Yeah, well, this is a new chapter in it, because to some extent, I've only recently, through the resurgence of white nationalism and white supremacy. By the way, I before I answer that, I want, Derek, could you define a difference? Because when we talk about white nationalism, are we talking about something that's different or more polite? Because I want to be clearer in my language in even answering these questions between white nationalism and white supremacy.
Yeah. That's, for me, I spent about 3 years after I had abandoned the white nationalist movement not saying anything. So it's been about a year where I have done anything like this. And I've thought a lot about this terminology. First of all, white nationalist is what the movement calls itself. It's the banner of Stormfront, my dad's website. It is pretty commonly respected term, even among people who want to be whatever, identitarian or American race realist or whatever. White nationalist is something that they would agree with. I think it's real in terms of like their explicit goals. They want the United States, their nation, to be 100% white. So it states in the words. They would claim, and they always do claim, that by separating everybody, they're going to get rid of racism, because people can't be racist if everybody's the same race in every area. So that's why it's not white supremacy, because East Asians have higher IQs than white people, so you're not even saying that white people are the best. If you really want to analyze this and try to figure out what's happening in our society, this is pure crazy white supremacy. But I can tell you, coming from growing up in it, that it's not that they're all walking around saying, yeah, master race, but we can't say that. Some are, but there's tons of people in the white nationalist movement who legitimately believe that they're not saying white people are better. They legitimately believe this inside their own heads. And for me, that was actually part of my process, is thinking about, there's no way to say in a country like the United States is founded on white supremacy, there's no way to say that you want to separate all the races that's not predicated on white supremacy. And that was something that I had to deal with. And maybe it's something that other white nationalists might deal with at some point. And sorry for the long-winded thing.
No,
that's why I use white nationalist, because for some reason after the 2016 election, the media started using it. Like, that was the weird moment when I heard Hillary Clinton say the word white nationalist, when I had spent my entire life thinking that, oh, this is the thing that only we know, we got to tell everybody. And then after that, it's in the New York Times, white nationalism explained has been a really surreal thing. And if people know what it means, it doesn't seem like you can hide under the term white nationalist. Like, there's no way somebody's going to say, I'm a white nationalist, and people are going to be like, oh, that sounds innocuous, like, right?
Yeah, yeah. So this is helpful, and I'll give just a brief sketch of this, the currency of black crime statistics or IQ statistics as unimpeachable or unavoidable or indefensible evidence of black inferiority. I mean, if white nationalists can concede that, say, Asians are superior to them, they also want to promote that blacks are not. And in that sense, those cold, hard facts of crime statistics have long served this purpose since the end of the late 19th century, deeply rooted in the emergence of a robust ideology of white supremacy, a set of scientific and social science ideas that were mobilized because the abject reality of the master and slave relation had been obliterated as a result of the Civil War. And so the emergence of these ideas, the collection of data, the proofs, the arguments, the interpretations, the mobilization of popular culture through Birth of a Nation, first motion picture, history enlightening, from the words of the president then at the time, to basically make a case that black crime statistics were the most salient, most important evidence that you could use to prove the point that black people were not only inferior and pathological, but they were a fundamental threat to the proper governing of a white Christian nation. And that rhetoric and articulation lived on throughout the entire 20th century. And just in case we don't get to it, I would argue that so much of the debate about policing, the back and forth between Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter about state and police violence versus activists calling for massive reform to policing, turns on competing interpretations of premature death among black people, in the notion that because black people do more harm to themselves, the state can't be culpable for having fearful police officers. So we have not escaped the trappings of this ideological discourse. And I would argue that every political constituency, liberals and Democrats, Republicans and conservatives, libertarians. I had a neighbor, talk about Trayvon Martin, literally at a bar mitzvah in my own neighborhood, tell my wife that Trayvon Martin deserved to die because George Zimmerman had every right to shoot him in self-defense. Self-identifies as a libertarian. So the mobilization of the idea of the facts of black criminality have served many purposes and continue to serve purposes, and to justify systemic practices like stop and frisk or broken windows policing or pretext stops, things that are on trial, or at least were on trial up to 2016, in terms of what we're going to do to uphold the constitutional right of individuals.
So while these white nationalists might be extreme or unusual in their explicitness, their ideas are already normalized, they're already embedded in our politics.
Mind if I comment on that? Just
yeah.
That another aspect of surreal life for me in the last year and a half especially, is coming out of this period where after I left white nationalism, saying to myself that Barack Obama was president and society was clear that white supremacy was bad and everybody was going to work towards that and it was all progressive and fine, and like legitimately believing that and burying myself in books for a couple of years. And then this last year and a half, where so much of what I taught people to talk about is mainstream political commentary, and just the list of that is black people are more criminal. We dog whistle a little bit and say, oh, why do you think the South Side of Chicago is so dangerous? It's because of the people who live there. And it's not hard to get to, well, it's a racial thing from there, or Hispanic immigration is different from European immigration, and the country is going to change for the worse, and it's not hard to get from there to it's a racial thing. And this is affirmative action is anti-white discrimination because it is privileging people over people who look like you. Like, this is stuff that I would take to normal people and I would get good responses, And it's the same thing that white nationalists say when they're trying to recruit, and it's the same thing that is very mainstream right now. And I guess always has been. I sort of wonder whether there was a couple of years where I thought that this is not a part of our society anymore, where I was trying to make myself believe that.
Well, you've said that your father, who founded the website Stormfront, that the people he targeted to recruit were not people on the fringe, but people who would start a sentence with, "I'm not a racist, but."
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, that he still is very discouraged constantly, that he says the white nationalist movement is too full of sociopaths. Like, this is something he's very upset about, that you end up with these fringy people, and he wants people who go to country music concerts that are 95% white to be explicit about what they love about America as its complexion, and to be explicit about all the stuff I just listed. Like, that's the goal. It's not to have a movement of a couple thousand people or a few hundred people who can go to a rally. The goal of the movement is to get people who are already against affirmative action and Hispanic immigration, and who are already worried that black communities aren't policed enough, to be explicit that they think it's about race, and to try to grow the number of people who are at some level willing to say, yeah, I think that's probably about race.
Khalil, why do you think right now is the time when white nationalists are willing to be public and march without hoods on their faces?
That's a question I think that has to include the election of Obama in 2008. On one hand, it's counterintuitive that we know a good chunk of the electorate, in terms of actual Trump voters, were also people who voted for Barack Obama in 2008. And Derek can speak more clearly to how much overlap there is within the white nationalist circles that he knows well. But to the extent that we overread that moment as an endorsement of a kind of post-racialism, that these voters fully embraced Obama as a representation of their ideological hopes and dreams, misses the point that so many commentators now recognize in the 2016 election. Some of those voters were then blowing up the system. And they're throwing up their hands with a Republican Party that had already, under George Bush, given up the ghost of responsible governance, and had escalated globalization, and had clearly been directly responsible for not looking out for the heart and soul of Rust Belt white America. And so what the hell do you have to lose but voting for the black guy? Because McCain himself represents exactly that. So we kind of forgot that lesson from 2016, because when we talked about those same two groups, we simply labeled them racist to some degree, or economically marginal in 2016. But I would argue a vote for Obama was not a proof that they didn't have anti-black ideas. And in fact, many of those people moved into Tea Party organizing. Some of those people embraced birtherism, of which Trump was one of the lead advocates for this view up and through the Republican primary candidacy. So understanding the way that the 2008 election was a catalyst for a discourse about taking back the country. People like Jared Taylor said, according to an investigative report in 2009, said on the record, I mean, a lot of us didn't hear this language directly, and certainly not in the company that Derek was keeping, but said that when I say take back the country, I mean take it back to a time when white people were clearly the majority of the country, clearly ran the institutions of government, were clearly the cultural representations of what America means in this country. And so that's back to 2009. And Jared Taylor's been busy for a long time, but certainly the mobilization of a political discourse and a political organizing certainly, I would say, is most proximate to the presidency of Barack Obama, the first election.
Derek, can you describe what you were doing right after Obama was elected? You went to a white nationalist conference where you talked about this as a pivotal moment.
Yeah, it's pretty essential to understand the fact that within the white nationalist world, within people organizing white nationalist rallies and conferences, the election of Obama was a huge recruitment wave. this incident on the election night that Stormfront crashed because the traffic rose so quickly once it became clear that Obama was going to actually win the presidency, that the bandwidth wasn't equipped to handle that kind of traffic, and the site went down for a couple hours before he was able to upgrade the servers. And then the weeks and months afterwards, there were huge numbers of people coming online saying, I never realized I'm losing the country, and becoming more explicit white nationalists. In the week after the election, I went and spoke at a Euro conference, which was organized by David Duke, and I had just that fall run this little campaign for the Republican Executive Committee, which is the 1,000 people nearest my house in Palm Beach County, which is across the water from Mar-a-Lago, which is Trump's place. And I went around before the November presidential election and said the stuff I've listed earlier, like affirmative action, that north side of town, which is those kind of people, is very criminal, like that kind of thing. And I won, I beat an incumbent with 60% of the vote, and it was this like test to see whether this would work in a small case and whether it could work in a larger case. And so I went to this conference in Memphis, Tennessee, which was hugely controversial. Tennessee, I think, had declared a state of emergency. We had to meet in secret and go into the room and try to hold the place before the police would show up and try to shut it down. It was a big deal. And so I went and gave this talk that my test case indicated that Obama's election does not mean white nationalism is losing. It means that we have this huge reservoir of people who are on the edge, and Obama can serve as a really good example to push them further. And we have evidence from the huge numbers of people who've been signing up on Stormfront this past 2 weeks. We have anecdotal, small evidence in this little Republican campaign I ran where they didn't know that I was the Don Black's son. They just knew that I was saying this stuff without saying quite too far, trying to get them to say it. And I had won with that, and so it was very encouraging. We were all very encouraged at the time that white nationalism would be a growing movement under Obama, and it was.
How do you think Trump's election has given them more confidence?
White nationalists? Mm-hmm. How, or do I think it has? Like, being out of it, I end up watching the news now.
What would you be thinking?
What's encouraging is one example, like the fact that he says these things, but one super example of the white nationalist movement itself is after Charlottesville. This, the one thing that white nationalists are confident in is that everybody in any position of power is going to condemn them. That it's so easy. Mayors, people who don't have power like mosquito commissioners will condemn the white nationalist rally because it's just so easy. And the first time that I, or any of them who are at that thing, or any white nationalist who wasn't there, has ever seen anybody hesitate and say, well, hold on, we need to give these people a fair shake, was that Tuesday. I mean, it was the Saturday a little bit, the hesitancy, that's weird, and everybody thought it would end there. But then the Tuesday where he comes back and says, no, actually there were good people at that thing. It's never happened before. Not in the 40 years that white nationalism has been a pretty cohesive anti-Semitic worldview ideology with people working for it. There has never been a person in a high position of power who hesitated to condemn it. And if the point of Charlottesville was to show that they could have a big rally and that the political climate now supported their message more so than it ever had, there's nothing that could have been more encouraging than that. So if you're on the fence, if you're saying, I think that race is a big deal, but this is a weird movement, that's so legitimizing. The president thinks it's, maybe okay. We should hear him out then. So if you're on the fence, like, that's great. Just go for it.
One thing we've talked about is when you would go to these conferences, everyone would be old, right? So it's the same old ideas, but there's one different thing, which is their ages. Can you talk about that?
I would like to ask you about this, actually. So I can say for sure, my entire life in white nationalism, I went to conferences many times a year. I spoke at them. I tried to organize them. I organized online through my dad's site. the organizations, whether Jared's Amren or American Renaissance or David's Euro or Council of Conservative Citizens, which is the organization that picked up for the citizens' councils, everybody at these things is gray-haired. Me and 2 other people would be under 40. And that was it, which is partly why I took this impression that this is not going to last. And a lot of that is because young people have a lot to lose. Young people I assumed, viewed it as a little bit archaic. Young people who show up to a rally like that are going to get their identities exposed online, and then it's going to be hard for them to get jobs. Even if they kind of agree, getting involved in this has no real future. At least that's what I thought. And I cannot actually explain what changed. The one striking thing about Charlottesville, amid a whole bunch of things that seemed very normal. Like when Charlottesville was on the news that Saturday, I was thinking like familiar. The one thing that was pretty striking was there's a ton of young kids, like college age or actual college students, who got on buses and went to this, who I don't think had been to an event like that before. And why was it no longer a problem that they were going to have their pictures online, that they were going to be outed?
We'd like to open it up to questions. There's microphones there, and up there. Well, why do you think?
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in on this. So, I'm going to say I don't know, but I think some factors that are worth considering are that the debates that were happening at the University of Missouri Columbus campus, which started with Nazi symbols on the college campus, here at Harvard, various incidents, including the taping of black faculty's faces on portraits at the law school, which was after a movement among undergraduates, hashtag I2M Harvard, similar movement at the University of Michigan, suggests at least that a climate amongst millennials of racial division and anxiety and animosity was in the zeitgeist, was in the space. I think that 2 things have accelerated it. I think the monuments debate, which became a lightning rod in the case of Richard Spencer and the alt-right rallies. And I think people like Mitch Landrieu in New Orleans, who had taken a very strong, robust opinion, collapsing the monuments that had been sacred ground in the South, no matter what your politics were, no matter how familiar or intimate you were with black people, had all of a sudden become ground zero for a new vision of America that was black and brown and without Confederate monuments. And people like Landrieu were stepping in that moment, which could be read as a kind of politics of Obamaism spreading around the country. And then I think Colin Kaepernick's move within the NFL as a challenge to the symbols of America's values animated more people who could be young and on the sidelines, who then could embrace this very vacuous notion of Americanism. And I use that term precisely because that was the language of the Klan in the 1920s, which was very much young and engaged with this question of what does it mean to have Jews and Catholics and immigrants and black people and the moral contagion, the criminality of our cities, which was part of the logic and language of that moment, also showed up in the John Birch movement in the 1950s, of which Goldwater himself famously said that Robert Welch, the founder of the Birch movement, was a crazy extremist, but the society itself was full of good people, which very much sounds familiar to this moment.
So for questions, there's just 2 rules. Say your name and make sure it really ends with a question mark. Start with you.
Peter Orta. I'm a medical student and also studying health policy at the Chan School. Prior to being here at the University of Florida, and as we know, Richard Spencer and the alt-right are having a rally there tomorrow. What is the best way that a community can respond to such a rally in a way that disarms their voices and minimizes its effect, from your perspective?
Derek, what do you think about that? I mean, you guys strategized about getting media attention.
Yeah, which is the thought that makes it so complicated, is the point of having the outdoor events like that is to get attention, and the way to get attention is to have counter-protesters. But my answer is still counter-protesters because I'm always worried that my example is going to get used as this like model that, oh yes, having conversations and stronger facts will convince people to be not racist. And absolutely not. It's having a strong vocal sense that we as a society do not accept this is what does that. And the reason why white nationalism is a fringe movement is not because what they believe is some alien thing that came to America from Mars. It's because we as a society don't accept that kind of talk. We accept it in a lot more subtle ways now. We don't want you to say that only white people should be allowed to immigrate here anymore. And they're trying to make it a little bit more acceptable, so counter-protesting is the thing to do if you can. But he also wants counter-protesting. He presumably wants some kind of clash. He wants to show that I don't know, that people want to shut up free speech or something. Hopefully it will be separated. Hopefully it will be more managed, but counter-protest. And I'm imagining myself, if I were in Gainesville and I'm thinking like counter-protest is the way to go, but I don't know, the nerve it takes to go stand up there and counter-protest is enormous. It's amazing. The people who were standing in front of the statue.
It was like 20 kids.
So, I mean, I can't say you go forth and counter-protest because I don't know if I could pull it off, but I still stand by that that's the way to do it, even though it's dangerous, it's risky, it's personal sacrifice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Kai Dittmann. I'm an MPA, first-year MPA student here at the HKS, and I'm from Germany. We see a rise of nationalism not just in the US, and most of the reasons you gave were very US specific. So my question is, do you think there is a global tendency towards nationalism? Are there strong links between the nationalist groups, which in Europe exist and I find weird to a certain degree, but that's neither here nor there? And if so, how do you work together if you work together?
Is that for me? White nationalist organizations do have a lot of connections with white nationalist organizations in Europe, or American white nationalist organizations talk to WNs in Europe, and it's not a perfect communication channel. It's difficult frequently for these people to get to know each other, and the European scene is so dramatically different from the political scene in the United States. I was familiar with people from the British National Party when I was involved. I knew the organizers, a little bit of the MPD in Germany, but not so much. And both of those parties have gone under the rug, it seems like. The AfD in Germany is much more significant than the MPD ever was. I cannot answer this question any much more thoroughly than that. I could give a fantastic book recommendation. There's a book written by Fatima El-Tayeb about European others, which I've found very useful for understanding this, being able to counter this idea that Europe is somehow different from the white supremacy of America. Because there is this trend where Europeans will say, oh, you know, we're not white supremacists, it's a weird racism is invented in America. It was absolutely not true. It's fundamental to European society. But it's a fantastic book that really lays out exactly why that is not the case. But the ways white nationalist organizations work are very different in Europe. So, and I can't start.
I have a quick story. So I was in Germany this past summer at a conference specifically developed by I'm going to mess up the name of the university, Technique University in Berlin. That's your university, yes. And they have a Holocaust Studies Institute. And that core faculty collaborated with Jewish Studies Center at Indiana University, former colleagues of mine from years ago. And so I appeared conversation with Roger Cohen in the New York Times, a number of other European scholars and American scholars looking at the intersections of anti-Semitism in Europe, as well as in racism in the United States. And there was tremendous anxiety, both local to where we were, but there was a sense, a distinct sense that Trump was in a class all his own as a representative of the United States in giving legitimacy to white nationalism in the United States. So I'll say that's one real distinction in terms of the mainstream political leadership, which I think is essentially what you were saying. The second is that I was in Germany and Berlin 3 years ago, visiting 8 prisons with a delegation of prison commissioners from Washington, Tennessee, Connecticut, along with a few scholars and other people who do criminal justice reform, including representatives of the Coke industries. And we visited these 8 prisons. And the whole idea was, how can it be that Germany treats its prisoners with so much care and compassion in individualized treatment, where murderers are out in 2.5 years and within 6 months are visiting their relatives so that they can re-socialize back to home. So, quick anecdote, one thing we discovered is that their system is more federal, so there's less discretion, it's more professional, in every way, both in shielding from the politics of vengeance, which very much animate the United States, and that the Americans help write the Constitution that governs the constitutional rights of the incarcerated. So here I am learning all of this. I come back home to America. I get flagged by customs, sent for additional screening, unlike any of my other colleagues. And the question I have is, why were you in Germany? Oh, I was in Germany studying why Germans do such a better job treating their incarcerated population, which, by the way, is a third foreign-born, overwhelmingly Turkish men of color. And I said, oh, well, I can tell you why they don't have as many black people. So, good old US of A.
You up there?
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I'm Dora. I'm a junior at the college. So Derek, you grew up in this world that was extremely saturated, as you said, in a fringe mentality. So what made you change? Was there like a catalyzing moment or something that made you realize that you didn't agree with what you'd been raised with?
Yeah, for me, it was a college experience. And a lot of different things. It wasn't one particular moment. It was... being an activist was unusual, even among white nationalists. Being somebody who was as prominent as I was unusual, and so I had a pretty high profile, and yet I wasn't outed for about a semester on campus. And then I was outed, and it was this liberal arts college with 800 people, so they had a pretty good united front of, we condemn this, but they didn't know what to do about it, and so they had huge forum discussions, and I just lived in this hot pot. But during that semester that I had first started, I had gotten to know several people, and one of them was a guy named Matthew Stevenson who hosted Shabbat dinners, and we knew each other. We had taken the same classes together, so he invited me to come to his Shabbat dinners, which were attended by everybody, lots of people. And so I went to that. It was very uncomfortable for a while, but he and I never talked about white nationalism. We would talk about everything else, and this is like the thing we're not going to bring up. And it continued that way. Matthew and I didn't talk about it, but there were other people, a particular person at the Shabbat dinners who we got to be friends. We would talk about things other than white nationalism, but we would also talk about white nationalism. I would explain, this is the belief system, we believe this. Here is an article published by American Renaissance that demonstrates why crime statistics are so stilted and why black people are more criminal and so therefore different. And then I would get back 2 or 3 days later, a bunch of journal articles demonstrating that that is totally ridiculous, and I think some of them were written by, and then we would talk about it. And so I didn't see myself as going away from the ideology. I thought I was making it stronger by, if talking about IQ differences between races was a misunderstanding of the statistics, I didn't want to use that. And so if I decided that didn't work, if I decided the criminal crime statistics didn't really work, I would just take these pieces out. And it's over about a year of that I got to a point where not only did I think the arguments I was trying to use to advocate were just false, they didn't really work, but also had this sense that when people are afraid of a white nationalist talking, that's not them misunderstanding that it's about civil discourse. There are power dynamics. There's a history of white supremacy. There's all this stuff that white privilege doesn't mean that white people don't have any problems. Like that kind of stuff, bit by bit, led me to a point where not only do the arguments not work, but what we're advocating is destructive to so many people, and the only logical outcome is violence to these people, and I can't condone having those beliefs with what I think is right. And so ended up getting to a point where I have to write a letter condemning white nationalism. Even though I had wanted to just never say anything to anyone ever again, I wrote a letter condemning it, and then that's like the moment where I'm not a white nationalist anymore. So that's my process.
You up there?
Yes, thank you all. My name is Jeff Rousset. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Professor Mohammed, so it seems to me like in this kind of resurgence of visible white supremacy in the form of tiki torch bearers, that there's the kind of risk that it obscures racism at the structural level in terms of the prison industrial complex and the ways that racism manifests itself in policy, that we have this idea that racism is people holding Confederate flags or tiki torches, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how we might be able to hold both of these ideas of racism, both at the kind of interpersonal level and also at the structural institutional level, as we think about this in a more kind of holistic way.
Yeah, well, we think about that in class I'm teaching, and so I'd love the students if they had a chance to weigh in. But I think one way to think about this, and I'd even be curious to have Derek respond. So you just mentioned prison industrial complex, and we certainly here at the Kennedy School had or have a program in criminal justice, and there's been some research around mass incarceration coming out of this institution. But how we got there, I mean, is a fascinating story of the wide-scale held beliefs that the system is doing its job just as it was intended to do, with the rare exception of a couple of bad apples who go overboard. So whether that's on the front end, on the policing side, or whether we occasionally find, like the New Yorker dug up, a couple months ago, a racist Southern judge in Alabama who was clearly violating judicial code with regard to sentencing people. And even if we acknowledge that there was some possibility for criminal justice reform, mostly it was about money in red states for this gigantic criminal justice system, about $80 billion. And it was at best about redemption for people who'd done terrible things in a kind of logic of second chances, but never was it in the widest possible circuits a fundamental acknowledgement that the civil rights movement had given birth to a set of criminalizing logics, that these people weren't entirely prepared for their freedom. And that as a result, we were going to build as many cages as we could to ensure that when they crossed the line, whatever that line was, no matter how thick or thin, they would be put in prison. And the irony, of course, is that about half of them, a third of them went to prison for drug offenses, about 50% went for robbery offenses, and then the rest in this category of homicide. And yet, it's not at all clear that the populations of whites who we are seeing both ravaged by the opioid crisis or the related criminality in that opioid crisis is generating the same punitive response. So that has nothing to do with the white nationalists and has everything to do with a system that was built in the wake of the civil rights movement by liberals and Democrats, by Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, Northerners and Southerners. Even the conversation about IQ, for both women in STEM and races is a conversation that bridges the world of Charles Murray and former president of Harvard University, Larry Summers, who's still here at the Kennedy School. So the proximity of these ideas are right here with us. They're not very far in terms of how do we explain how these systems function.
Hi, I'm Andrea. Thank you for being here. This is primarily a question for Professor Muhammad, but I'm interested in both of your perspectives. I think one of the most knee-jerk reactions to when you're trying to sort of combat racist language ends up being like, don't target my free speech. And I'm just wondering why it's free speech instead of like, I don't know, you're just being a mean person, or it's fundamentally that First Amendment. And I'm just wondering if there's a history behind that and what options there are to sort of combat that.
Yeah, so there is a history, but I think we have to separate. So there are many constituents on both sides, but to the extent that the diversity of views that uphold the principle of the First Amendment are animated in part by conservatives of various kinds, from extremists to middle of the road, who see the openness of the logic of free speech as a vehicle for supporting white nationalist views or even anti-black views, is what I would refer to when it comes to educational outcomes or disparities, as well as the criminal justice system. Then there are people who believe the First Amendment is the most sacrosanct guarantee that the right to dissent in a moment of authoritarianism, in a moment of terror, the ability to expose the lies of official power, to bring light to the power of the organizations, of racist organizations, is the guarantee, or the best guarantee that we will have freedom. And so you take Margaret Atwood, for example, who says that, in The Handmaid's Tale, in the midst of the most extreme totalitarianism, in the midst of the greatest fear, that there is no hope, the fact of telling a story is the belief that someone will one day read it. And so therefore, it is also that voice, very rooted in liberal ideas of progressive, of left, who also will hold on to the First Amendment. There is no easy answer to the question of the relationship of speech to the potential for violence, whether it is psychological or physical. But we are all making choices in our institutional moments, in the institutional cases, to weigh those trade-offs. And some people will choose to silence that speech for good reasons that may be short-term gains for long-term losses. You just don't know.
I think I'd also like to answer that within the context of the white nationalist movement, which is really something that you should understand is coming out of the civil rights movement, after the civil rights movement, and the way it works as a cohesive ideology with all the pieces put in place. It's something that comes after what they see is like social trends changing. They reframe how they're going to speak about it. They start talking about equality and adopting a lot of the language of the civil rights movement and saying the sort of things like what you're talking about, Christopher Cantwell saying, I wanted to be a liberal egalitarian, but I just couldn't. That is really only since the 1960s, and within that, free speech has been a major virtue that they'll repeat, because after the civil rights movement, after the 1960s, so the 70s and 80s and 90s, it sees itself as a movement that is oppressed, that is speaking a truth that is so dangerous that this society can't let you hear it because it's so true you'll believe it immediately. White nationalist leaders have very good things to say about the ACLU because there's a long history of white nationalist rallies appealing to the ACLU to help them get permits, to help them get their message out on the virtue that free speech at all costs, and that their message will be suppressed if they can't get support in the guise of free speech. So, like what you're seeing now with free speech being this issue that's central to white nationalism is something that's been going on for decades and decades, and this relationship of the ACLU to white nationalism, not to condemn the ACLU or anything, is interesting. Like it's thought of quite well among WN organizers.
Yeah, I'll say the white nationalists in Charlottesville told me they were going to protest in this one park, and then they were denied. Their permit was revoked. It was and eventually reinstated, but while it was revoked, they told me they planned to march to the original park anyway with the hopes of getting arrested, because it was all about the appearance of looking like this speech was so powerful and ultimately so convincing that the state had to crush it so no one would hear it. They're very sophisticated about using that.
Hey, how y'all doing? My name is Steve Nunez. I am studying religion, ethics, and politics at the Divinity School, and I'm from Wilmington, North Carolina. First and foremost, thank all three of y'all for your great work. I would kind of like to pick up on the thread of some of the analytical distinctions that we've made between white nationalism and white supremacy, along with some of the distinctions that Professor Muhammad has made between liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, and this North-South divide. I think historically we've seen that this idea of white supremacy is only a Southern thing, and with this election, in my perspective, I've seen it shifting more to an urban and rural thing. Yet, the entire time in the history of the United States, part of this white supremacist project has been propagated by liberals or white moderates, and we see this echoed throughout Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, James Baldwin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even, for example, in a class yesterday, I heard someone say it's everyone that supports Donald Trump and all of us. And I took a little bit of, I found it problematic, because that assumes that Hillary Clinton and the Clinton dynasty and some of the things that liberals have done throughout the history of the United States is somehow less white supremacist. So my question is, by calling liberals as well as white nationalists white supremacists, what do we gain in the conversation and what do we lose in the conversation? And I was wondering if y'all could speak to that from your particular perspectives, from media, from a white nationalist lens, and from your lens as a historian, Professor Muhammad.
We'll start with you. Or Derek?
He's our guest. He's a student of mine, so if I don't run out of time, I can circle back to him. Yeah.
The observation that I want to make is probably the most important one that I think I can make. As whatever role that I have to try to write or speak about this movement, which is a fringe movement, I think the most important one is to point out that looking at the beliefs of white nationalists is a prism or a mirror or something to look at the society that they live in. And that is not a conservative thing. It's easier to appeal to conservatives for whatever reason. It's easier to try to get conservatives to be a little bit more reactionary, a little quicker. But think about the goal. All a white nationalist wants at the base level is that everybody in the room will be white. And my dad and I had lots of conversations trying to crack the liberal, trying to crack the white liberal, that we can observe that white liberals very frequently segregate themselves into neighborhoods that are majority white. They'll be friends with people who are almost entirely white. They will put themselves into enclaves, and that there's a difficulty that they'll say anti-racist things, but from the pure perspective of somebody who's trying to get people to be a little bit more racist, to put it bluntly, there's nothing that's especially impossible about cracking a white liberal in that sense, and we didn't figure it out. But there's nothing wrong with liberal beliefs from a white nationalist perspective. All that's wrong, all that a white nationalist is really opposed to is diversity. It is immigration of people who are not white into the United States. It is economic parity between black people and white people. It is rooms that are not 95% white, and those come in every political band. And so from that really pure, just what do white nationalists want perspective, I don't really see a distinction. If I'm going to define white supremacy as these resources and rooms and spaces and power that are reserved for white people, liberal universities have that
Harvard,
to a T.
Harvard.
Well, I can talk about something that I've observed, which is that in the post-election debate, Bernie versus Hillary, and the deep-rooted economic anxiety of Trump voters, there's this undercurrent of an idea that economic justice, that it's either identity politics or economic justice, that one costs the other. And something that I think is really disturbing, I don't have any answers to how to deal with this, but is that a lot of these alt-right guys, they accept the critiques of the left of our society. For example, I was talking to this guy making kind of like the liberal technocratic case against racism, that it's against the economic interests of working class whites because it means we can't have universal health care because, suspicion of government interference correlates with racial resentment, right? If they would just be less racist, they could have health care. And this alt-right guy I was talking to was like, you're right, we can't be Sweden because we have black people. I'm like, well, the solution is to make white people less racist. He laughed at me. He's like, no, it's to get rid of black people. And I don't think that that's going to be an appealing argument to a large majority of leftists or even a small majority, but they are capable of radicalizing some disaffected white liberal males. And that's something to pay attention to.
I would just add to that maybe clarifying what I said before, that in a sentence, it's just the fear that there's nothing about white liberals that makes them immune from white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. I'll add a kind of an anecdote that I think bears this out. My wife's an elected school board member in a very liberal, upper-income community in New Jersey, and it's a community that we would describe as intentionally integrated. That for the past 40 years, since there was white flight from Newark, this community has held a core group of mostly Jews who've committed themselves to staying in this community, to pushing back against blockbusting, to embracing mostly African Americans moving in over these many years. And my wife and myself are very much embedded in this community and appreciate and love it. But inside of those schools, particularly in the high school, which is 50% African American, there is apartheid with regard to the notion that one thing that holds white parents who are liberal in this community is the fact that they pay high property taxes and they can guarantee that their child's getting the best education, and the best education is often a proxy for seeing very few black kids in that classroom. And so the landscape of a kind of, what was once neoconservative, the idea that a liberal who'd been mugged becomes a neoconservative, to the idea of a technocratic neoliberal who is using big data to make predictive analytical claims about who's deserving and undeserving, from everything from prison programming to a quality education to a free lunch or entry to an elite university. Ends up reproducing the same basic ideas, that some people are deserving and should be there and some people shouldn't. And diversity and inclusion has become, you have a problem when the concept is attractive to everyone. When Mike Pence and Tim Kaine were debating Black Lives Matter and what to do with the legitimate critique of policing, or the problem of police trust between African Americans and policing communities, when they both had the same answer, which was community policing, then you have a problem. Because it's too easy to do those things. So, I think this was incredibly revealing for me, this notion that the sheer presence of white power in elite institutions and in the sheer demographic representation of influence itself is a predicate for the possibility of spreading those ideas, or at least celebrating that they haven't lost entirely, no matter whether there's one of me around.
Thank you.
And we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you for your work. My name is Sydney. I'm an MPP student, and I'm curious about, as this type of white nationalism is growing in visibility and normalization, what are some of the systems that exist that we can lean on to protect our communities? And then on the flip side, what are some of the systems that we need to be building in order to protect our communities?
Khalil, do you want to start with that?
Well, I'm a firm believer that we have to start in our schools of learning. So to the extent that we have done a terrible job teaching the actual history of this country, that for the most part, what passes as social studies is civic nationalism, divorced of any real critique or lessons that we might have learned about the nature of humanity, its capacity to do great harm to itself, the very foundation of institutional racism, from chattel slavery to Jim Crow, which gets us pretty much to a few years before I was born. I mean, it's like astounding that the discomfort with which Americans have to face this history means that they mostly retreat behind a kind of mythology that says that America is the one that made it possible for us to expand the franchise. America is responsible for the fact that we have had a first black president. It's not the people who rose up through various forms of dissent and activism who made those sacrifices. So I'm a firm believer that if we don't do something about what we teach in our schools everywhere in this country, beginning at very young ages, that we're going to continue to see the reproduction of these ideas for many decades to come.
I would answer actually with the explicit example of Charlottesville, Virginia, because it's not for no reason that it was chosen as a site for many white nationalist events. That's a city that, as a white nationalist, I went to several times on sort of pilgrimages, because, not to do a deep dive into modern white nationalist ideology, but it's what Jefferson is a great patron saint because he represents this liberalism and this explicit racial separation ideology in his writing. And Charlottesville is the town he lived near and where he founded the university. And there's statues of both Jefferson and Confederate heroes in that town. It's quite nice. It has all these amenities. It's a nice community, and yet there are Confederate flags flying in the neighborhoods outside of the city. And it's a place where I felt very welcomed as a white nationalist, because you see these symbols that this white nationalist ideology that founded the country is all very well alive in this university, which has all those same, like, liberals are not immune to white supremacy issues. And then when this rally happened, I don't know whether Charlottesville takes into account the messaging that they give by having the statues. I assume after the rally they thought about it a bit more, but in that specific example, there's so many explicit anti-racist things they could say by taking down the statues, by being more explicit and more aware that we are a majority white community and we have to include everybody in our community in ways that they don't. I've been at events affiliated with the University of Virginia. I once attended a lecture at the University of Virginia where a black man spoke about the fact that the values of diversity that the University of Virginia represents today are predicated on the values of diversity that Thomas Jefferson taught us all those years ago. And everybody in the room clapped, and it was completely insane. And the people of color in the room looked back and forth and said, "Where am I?" And that's Charlottesville. It's not, I don't know what, it's not the lynching city, but it's a city that, as a person of color, I wouldn't feel comfortable in Charlottesville. And that's an example of a place that thinks they're very anti-racist. And so how do we protect our communities? And an example of there's so much they could do to make it not a place that a white nationalist wants to pilgrimage to.
A quick story about Charlottesville. So my first academic job was as an applicant for assistant professorship of history at Charlottesville. At UVA. And I really wanted this job because at the time my family were living in the New York area, and there's not a lot of great tenure track jobs, and this is a top public university and a very strong reputation in the history department. So I held out for the job talk, held out for the offer, finally get the offer, and went down and felt literally like a fish out of water. As a kid who'd grown up in Chicago, my parents were born there. There was something about the slave quarters in the middle of campus, the notion that this is not a campus because that's an insult to the traditions of this institution. These are our grounds. No graduate students showed any interest in what I was doing. I sat in a mail room waiting to talk with graduate students. None showed up. And you can measure the temperature of any institution that's hiring you at least by some measure of enthusiasm. And this, I'm not saying that this is a perfect example of what you're describing, but this is. So I leave the campus. I'm deliberating. I decide not to go. I went to Indiana University in the heart of Klan country. But they were intentional about their recent history and what it meant to work against that history and to be explicit about it. And that made a lot of difference. So I remember talking back to a fellow who was there and saying, I decided not to come. What's been your experience? He's like, man, you made the right choice. And within 24 hours, a news story reported that in Albemarle County, the sheriff was looking for a rapist who was identified as an African American. And they got the bright idea to swab the cheeks of every black person on the UVA campus in order to identify the rapist. So if you can just pause for a moment and appreciate the political invisibility of looking for any white man accused of any particular crime by virtue of identifying the entire local population and saying we're going to find this criminal no matter what. That is the difference between white privilege in a space that is defined by whiteness as opposed to being black in a space like that where anything is possible. And fortunately that was disrupted, so not all hope is lost. But the work that is required to inoculate a community from those ideas and the possibility for how they might be implemented in the world is a tremendous burden on people of color, whether they're black or Latino or Asian in many instances, depending on where they are.
I don't want to try to add to it, but I just do want to make this statement that being a person who is, I guess, trying to undermine white nationalism and white supremacy now.
You better say more than I guess if you want to get out of here.
Well, it feels weird to say, oh, I'm a white nationalist activist, and now I'm an anti-white nationalist activist. But yeah, I guess. What works really well for trying to convince white people to be a bit more racist is telling them that if they don't buy into this, then people are going to guilt them forever, and they're going to be white guilted, and everybody. That's what people who want diversity want. They want to guilt you and tell you white people are the worst, and white people buy into that really easily. Like when you're trying to recruit for this, people are like, yes, that's it. I don't want to be guilted. And now I look at it and it's just why if you look and you see the slave quarters at UVA, feeling like you have to preserve them and add them to the campus tour is some kind of weird white guilt, and feeling like we can't just get rid of that or we can't condemn it or something is feeling like they are the slave owners because they're descended from them. And now I look at it and I'm like, there's no reason why I can't break from this and say, it happened. The power has been transferred to me now, but I'm going to undo it. And I am not the person who did this, and this. And yet it's so hard. White people do not want to do that. I don't think any white people want to do that. They feel like they are the slave owner, that they are every white person who ever lived, and that they have to stand up for them in some way. And that's really where a white nationalist can say, yes, come with me.
Right. That's a good point.
Well, but so how would you counteract that from the other side, how do you turn that inside out and say, like, yeah, you're going to feel a bad feeling because you have to think about people who suffer because they don't look like you? Like, how do you get around that? Yeah. Like, can you invert your old recruiting tactics?
Nothing more than just, suck it up. It's hard, and and do it. But it is super hard, and I don't want to get pessimistic, but that's where I get really worried that we're not going to fix this in a century or 2 centuries, because people don't want to in a lot of cases. It's a lot easier to be a low-key white nationalist than it is to be an anti-racist. One is just like how it is now is fine. That's the low-key white nationalist. And anti-racist is changing what this world is. Like, trying to be an anti-racist activist is so much more imposing than, going to that rally was for them.
I love this response because I just want to remind everyone of the obvious, which is that it was your exposure to a community of learning that made it possible for you to see your way clear to the other side. So it wasn't just that you were uncomfortable, it was that you sat in a space that made it possible. It's not an accident that in the 2012 election and in the 2016 election, we heard a major party describe college as a place that was not suitable for most Americans, and that it would be an insult to everyday Americans to suggest, as President Obama suggested in his efforts to lower the cost of college, that you should go to college. Because part of the logic is that is a place where bad things happen to white people. They are made to feel guilty. And if you want your sons and daughters to actually respect you and come home at night and not with a Jew or a Mexican in tow, don't send them to college. So thank God you went to college.
So on that cheerful-ish note, thank you both for coming. This was really great.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thanks a lot. Nice. Thanks, Williams. Hope we stay in.